On the 4th of August 1940, 3 waves of Luftwaffe bombers struck what appeared to be a fully operational RAF fighter station near Tangmere in Sussex. Intelligence photographs had shown unmistakable signs of military activity: hangars with distinctive shadows, Hurricane fighters arranged on dispersal pans, petrol lorries parked near the perimeter, even anti-aircraft gun emplacements. The German crews dropped their bombs with precision, confident they'd delivered a devastating blow to Fighter Command's defensive network. They hadn't. They'd attacked Gumber Farm, a field cleared by RAF personnel with picks and shovels, populated with canvas and wood aircraft that cost £15 each to build, and guarded by Lewis guns mounted on wooden posts. The real RAF Tangmere, 3 miles away, remained untouched. This wasn't luck. It was the opening salvo in what would become the most sophisticated deception campaign of the Second World War, masterminded by a retired Royal Engineers colonel who understood a fundamental truth. What reconnaissance cameras see matters more than what's actually there. Standard military thinking in 1939 emphasised hardened defences and dispersed assets. The Air Ministry's pre-war doctrine called for widely separated aircraft on reinforced concrete hardstands, protected by blast pens and anti-aircraft batteries. Airfields were built with the assumption that being seen was inevitable. The goal was merely to survive the resulting attack. German intelligence agreed. Luftwaffe target folders meticulously catalogued every RAF station in Britain, hangar locations, runway alignments, technical sites, even the positions of water towers and wireless masts. The folders distributed to bomber crews showed these installations ringed in red, numbered and annotated in precise German script. Flugplatz, 4 hangars, aircraft parking areas. Mathematics seemed inescapable. If you knew where something was, you could destroy it. But Colonel John Fisher Turner, appointed in September 1939 to establish Britain's deception programme, asked a different question. What if the enemy's certainty about your location was your greatest weapon? Turner, who'd served as Director of Works and Buildings at the Air Ministry since 1931, possessed an unusual combination of skills: qualified pilot, civil engineer, and possessed of a mind that thought like a film director. He established his headquarters not at a military installation but at Sound City Film Studios in Shepperton, Surrey. His staff weren't soldiers but set designers, lighting technicians, prop makers and scenic artists. Whilst conventional military planners focused on making real targets harder to hit, Turner's team focused on making fake targets impossible to ignore. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. German bombers carried finite ordnance loads. Every bomb dropped on a dummy site was a bomb that wouldn't hit a factory, a squadron, or a city. Turner called his daytime installations K-sites, decoy airfields designed to draw attacks away from operational stations. By the summer of 1940, he'd established 100 dummy airfields across Britain, protected by approximately 400 dummy aircraft. The secret wasn't in creating perfect replicas, it was in understanding exactly what German reconnaissance cameras would record. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft operated at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, using high-resolution cameras capable of capturing remarkable detail. Photo interpreters at German intelligence facilities could identify aircraft types, count vehicles, and assess damage from previous raids. They looked for specific signatures: the distinctive cruciform shape of hangars, the dark rectangles of tarmac dispersal pans, the thin lines of perimeter tracks. Most critically, they looked for shadows. In aerial photography, shadows don't lie. They reveal 3-dimensional structures that paint alone cannot disguise. A hangar casts a shadow, an aircraft casts a shadow. Even a petrol lorry, if the sun angle is correct, casts a recognizable shadow. German photo interpreters were trained to read these shadows like text, cross-referencing sun position with time of day to verify that what they saw was genuine. Turner's film industry experts understood this intimately. They'd spent years creating the illusion of depth on 2-dimensional sets. The challenge with dummy aircraft wasn't making them look real up close, it was making their shadows appear real from 6 miles up. The solution was elegantly simple. Paint the shadows directly onto the ground. Canvas and frame Spitfires and Hurricanes were elevated on spindly poles, typically 18 to 24 inches high. The propeller itself often served as one of the support points. Beneath and slightly offset from each dummy aircraft, ground crews painted dark shadows using bituminous emulsion, the same coal tar-based paint used for tarmac surfaces. The shadows weren't mere dark patches. They were carefully shaped to match the sun angle for the time of day when reconnaissance flights were most likely. For morning light, shadows extended to the west. For afternoon light, to the east. Some installations changed their shadow pattern seasonally as the sun's angle shifted. The effect was devastating. In one documented instance, a German photo interpreter examining images of a K site near RAF Debden noted in his analysis numerous aircraft visible on dispersals, shadow patterns consistent with morning reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe mounted a substantial raid on the location. Every aircraft was made of painted canvas stretched over timber frames, manufactured by Green Brothers Engineering Company in Hailsham for £15 per unit, roughly 1/10,000th the cost of an actual Hurricane. The real RAF Debden, meanwhile, had dispersed its fighters into the surrounding countryside, parking them beneath trees in carefully selected locations where natural foliage broke up their outlines. The conventional view held that aircraft needed concrete beneath them, clear approaches for taxiing, and open spaces for maintenance. Fighter Command's pre-war doctrine specified that dispersal areas should be positioned around the airfield perimeter at intervals of at least 150 feet, constructed of reinforced concrete in either frying pan or spectacle loop configurations. Each hard stand cost hundreds of pounds to build and was plainly visible from the air, a clear target marker saying aircraft here. Critics argued that without proper surfaces, undercarriages would sink into soft earth, making aircraft unserviceable. Without clear approaches, pilots would find maneuvering impossible. Without dedicated maintenance areas, keeping fighters operational would prove impractical. Standard thinking, in short, held that effective air operations required purpose-built infrastructure. Reality proved otherwise. In the summer of 1940, RAF squadrons began hiding fighters in forests, not in purpose-built shelters, but simply beneath trees. Pilots would taxi their Hurricanes and Spitfires off the standard dispersal pans and into tree-lined areas bordering airfields. Ground crews laid metal tracking or timber planking to prevent undercarriages sinking into soft ground. Simple solutions that cost shillings rather than pounds. Natural tree cover, pilots discovered, was remarkably effective concealment. The irregular canopy broke up aircraft outlines. Dappled light and shadow disguised the distinctive shapes that photo interpreters sought. Most importantly, forests were everywhere, and German reconnaissance couldn't photograph every tree line in southern England. The dispersal technique evolved rapidly through practical experience. Squadrons learned that hardwood forest with mature trees provided better cover than conifer plantations. Oak and beech canopies created irregular shadow patterns that confused aerial observation, whilst pine forests showed more regular spacing that drew the eye. Aircraft were positioned nose first into tree lines, with the engine cowling, the most recognisable element of a fighter's profile, tucked deepest into the foliage. Ground crews camouflaged the tail section, which inevitably protruded, using cut branches and camouflage netting. Refueling and rearming occurred under the trees. Pilots reported that the technique added perhaps 5 minutes to their scramble time, a trivial cost for near-complete concealment. At RAF Beaulieu in the New Forest, 15 hard stands were positioned along the perimeter track, conforming to Air Ministry standards. But the real parking areas were in Hawk Hill enclosure, where bombs were stored on flat concrete bases hidden beneath timber and camouflage roofs supported by telegraph poles. Dispersal huts, simple Nissen structures designated on wartime plans as Type 2 965/42, were positioned between gorse bushes and tree lines, invisible from above. Similar techniques spread across Fighter Command. At RAF Stony Cross, also in the New Forest, 3 concrete runways were built to standard specifications. Aircraft used them for takeoff and landing, then immediately dispersed into the surrounding woodland. Reconnaissance photographs showed the runways clearly, but consistently failed to locate the actual fighter strength. The principle extended beyond individual aircraft. Entire bomb stores disappeared into forest enclosures. Fuel dumps were positioned beneath tree canopies. Even maintenance facilities were hidden, not in obvious hangars, but in dispersed workshops that German photo interpreters dismissed as farm buildings or civilian structures. The forest, it turned out, wasn't an obstacle to air operations. It was the airfield's most valuable asset. On 27th of July 1940, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed RAF Yedon in West Yorkshire. The resulting images showed 3 large hangars with distinctively camouflaged roofs, their outlines broken up with irregular paint patterns. More interestingly, they showed what appeared to be agricultural land bisected by a hedge line running diagonally across several fields. The hedge was, in fact, a runway, and the hedge line was painted directly onto the tarmac in dark green and brown. German photo interpreters, trained to identify artificial structures, looked for regular geometric shapes that didn't match natural landscapes. The Yedon runway, carefully painted to mimic the surrounding field patterns, appeared to be nothing more than farmland. This technique, painting false field boundaries and hedge lines onto runways and hardstands, became standard practice across RAF stations by mid-1940. At RAF Staverton in Gloucestershire, camouflage artists created an imitation lane that snaked diagonally across the airfield. They painted boundaries to mimic hedges in dark brown and green. Sections of the runway received irregular dark shapes designed to simulate woodland. From 20,000 feet, the installation appeared to be rolling countryside with patchy tree cover, unremarkable landscape that German photo interpreters would scan past while searching for geometric certainties. The illusion wasn't perfect. Close examination would reveal the deception. But Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft couldn't loiter for close examination. They flew fast at high altitude, and photo interpreters worked from single-pass imagery. What appeared unremarkable in a first glance simply didn't receive a second. At RAF Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire, engineers exploited the site's natural advantages. The airfield had been deliberately constructed in low ground between tributaries of the River Cam, boggy terrain that produced persistent mist. Before concrete runways were laid, the grass landing strips were painted to blend into surrounding fields. After conversion to Class A standards in 1942, requiring extensive concrete work, the areas between runways received agricultural camouflage. Dark green patches simulated ploughed earth. Lighter sections suggested fallow ground or growing crops. Curved lines mimicked drainage ditches and farm tracks. The concrete runways themselves, 150 feet wide and up to 2,000 yards long, were treated with coarse pre-coloured stone chippings to reduce shine and break up their stark appearance. At RAF Gosport, similar experiments used fine pre-coloured slag chippings, techniques borrowed from non-shine hard tennis court construction. The paint itself was subject to intensive research. The Paint Research Station at Teddington, now the Paint Research Association, published detailed specifications in 1939. Bituminous emulsions were designated for tarmac surfaces, concrete and felted roofs, materials that would accept coal tar-based paints. These created the dark shadows beneath dummy aircraft and the false hedge lines across runways. For grass areas and open ground, dusting powders consisting of chalk or gypsum mixed with pigment and adhesive were finely ground and scattered to create field patterns. The powder settled into grass, creating the appearance of agricultural land without killing the vegetation. Important because actual aircraft still needed to use these surfaces. The most elaborate deception occurred at RAF Hinton in the Hedges in Northamptonshire, where number. One camouflage unit, based at the airfield itself, painted wooden hedge patterns across the southwestern half of the entire installation. Aerial photographs from November 1940 show Blenheim bombers and Anson trainers clearly visible on dispersal pans, but those dispersal pans appear to be embedded in a patchwork of woodland and hedgerows. The boundaries between operational spaces and camouflaged areas were deliberately blurred. Perimeter tracks received false hedge lines at intervals that matched genuine field boundaries in the surrounding countryside. Where concrete met grass, the transition was disguised with irregular paint patterns that suggested natural landscape variation rather than military construction. German intelligence knew RAF stations existed in these locations, but knowing a station existed and being able to identify its exact layout, its operational areas, its vulnerable points, that was the intelligence that enabled precision bombing. Turner's camouflage program didn't make airfields invisible, it made them illegible. On the 15th of September 1940, the date now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, Luftwaffe intelligence estimated Fighter Command's operational strength at approximately 150 serviceable fighters. They based this estimate partly on direct combat reports, partly on loss assessments, and partly on reconnaissance photographs showing aircraft on known airfields. The actual figure was 732 serviceable fighters. The 580 aircraft discrepancy existed because German photo interpreters were counting what they could see, and what they could see was increasingly fictitious. K-site dummy aircraft appeared in their tallies as genuine fighters. Real squadrons hidden in forests appeared as destroyed or non-operational. Airfields heavily camouflaged with false field patterns appeared as secondary or training stations rather than operational bases. The intelligence failure had operational consequences. Luftwaffe raid planning relied on their assessments of RAF strength. When raids encountered fiercer resistance than expected, more fighters than intelligence suggested should exist, German aircrew reported that Fighter Command must be transferring squadrons from the north. This wasn't happening. The fighters were simply hidden, and the Luftwaffe was attacking expensive decoys whilst missing real targets. The 4th of August raid on Gumber Farm near Tangmere represented precisely this dynamic. 3 bombing waves struck what German intelligence assessed as an active fighter station. The crews returned reporting successful hits on hangars, dispersal areas, and parked aircraft. The reality was timber, canvas, and 15-pound dummy hurricanes. Real Tangmere, 3 miles distant, launched fighters that intercepted subsequent raids. The effectiveness of decoys varied with implementation quality. Simple dummy aircraft fooled no one at low altitude but proved remarkably effective against high-altitude reconnaissance. Canvas stretched over plywood frames, painted with semi-gloss paint to simulate metal surfaces, and including visible details like flap lines, aileron hinges and canopy frames, created convincing imagery from 25,000 feet. The key refinement was the shadow. Dummy aircraft elevated on poles, with painted shadows beneath them oriented to match the sun angle, passed photo interpreter scrutiny. Flat cutouts painted to simulate 3-dimensional aircraft, used by both German and Allied forces, rarely succeeded because they lacked shadows and changed appearance dramatically with sun angle. The dummy aircraft industry became remarkably sophisticated. When Colonel Turner first approached aircraft manufacturers about producing decoys, they proposed complex designs costing significant sums. Turner, in what proved a characteristic flash of insight, asked the film prop industry to tender instead. Film set builders at Shepperton and other studios produced canvas and frame Hurricanes, Spitfires and Blenheims for roughly 1/4 the aircraft manufacturers' quoted prices. These weren't crude approximations. Surviving examples show attention to detail. Propeller blades with visible pitch, undercarriage struts with cross-bracing, even roundel markings in the correct positions. From ground level, they appeared obviously fake. From camera altitude, they were indistinguishable from operational aircraft, provided they had proper shadows. By late 1940, Turner's operation had expanded to include Q-sights, nighttime decoys using electric lights to simulate airfields. Initially, these used paraffin lamps positioned to replicate landing strip lights. But this proved dangerous to actual RAF aircraft attempting to identify genuine stations in darkness. The solution was electrically powered installations with control bunkers where operators could illuminate the dummy airfield only after German bombers had been detected approaching. A typical Q-site installation featured a flare path nearly 1 kilometre long, with lights spaced approximately 100 metres apart. To prevent friendly aircraft attempting to land, both ends of the false runway displayed hooded red lights, visible only at low level, a signal to RAF pilots that the runway was fake. This wasn't theatrical whimsy dressed up as military strategy. It was hard-edged understanding of how reconnaissance and targeting worked in an era before thermal imaging, radar mapping and satellite surveillance. Luftwaffe intelligence operated under specific constraints. Their reconnaissance aircraft were fast but had limited time over target. Their cameras were high resolution but captured fixed moments, and their photo interpreters were skilled but human. They looked for patterns, for certainties, for the geometric regularity of military installations. Turner's program systematically exploited every one of these constraints. The forest dispersal technique worked because reconnaissance couldn't photograph everything. Southern England contained thousands of square miles of woodland. German intelligence couldn't task photo interpreters to examine every tree line, every hedgerow, every farm track. They focused on known airfields, identified structures, geometric certainties. Aircraft hidden beneath irregular tree canopies weren't invisible. They simply weren't where photo interpreters expected to look. The painted runways worked because photo interpreters trusted their pattern recognition. A hedge line looked like a hedge line. A field boundary appeared as a field boundary. The false patterns were designed not to withstand scrutiny, but to pass initial examination, to be dismissed as unremarkable landscape rather than military infrastructure. The dummy aircraft succeeded because they satisfied every photographic signature that interpreters sought. Correct size, proper shadow, appropriate positioning on dispersal pans. Photo interpreters weren't expecting elaborate deceptions. They were looking for aircraft, and these showed aircraft-shaped objects with aircraft-shaped shadows in aircraft-appropriate locations. The expectation created the reality, at least photographically. The broader principle was one of cognitive load. German intelligence processed thousands of reconnaissance images daily. Photo interpreters worked under time pressure, searching for specific intelligence requirements. Anything that appeared obviously military received detailed analysis. Anything that appeared ambiguous or civilian received cursory examination. Turner's camouflage program weaponized this distinction, making genuine military installations appear ambiguous, whilst making obvious military decoys screamingly visible. At RAF Saint-Val in Cornwall, a coastal command installation that suffered numerous Luftwaffe raids in 1941, aerial photographs show bomb craters surrounding damaged hangars, but also show the extensive camouflage painting designed to obscure the airfield's runways as hedge and field patterns. The bombing proved the camouflage wasn't perfect, but damage analysis suggested German bombers consistently missed operational areas whilst hitting less critical spaces. Photo interpreters could identify that an airfield existed at Saint-Val. They struggled to identify precisely where aircraft were parked, where fuel was stored, where the truly vulnerable points lay. Bombs fell on concrete, but the aircraft survived in forest dispersals. The success of RAF camouflage and deception didn't stem from any single technique, but from the integration of multiple approaches into a coherent system. Dummy airfields drew attacks away from real stations. Forest dispersal concealed operational aircraft. Painted runways confused target identification. False shadows validated dummy aircraft. Each element reinforced the others, creating layered uncertainty in German intelligence assessments. Luftwaffe commanders never knew with certainty whether they were attacking real targets or expensive fakes. That uncertainty alone justified the program. The human element proved equally critical. Turner's team included landscape painters who understood how terrain appeared from altitude, lighting technicians who could calculate sun angles and shadow positions, and engineers who could translate artistic concepts into buildable structures. Alan Sorrell, a camouflage officer whose children later recalled his work, spoke of continuing hedgerow lines across airfields, simple conceptually, but requiring precise understanding of both landscape patterns and photographic interpretation. Ground crews manning the decoy sites showed remarkable dedication. These were servicemen whose assignment was to make themselves targets, walking flare paths at dusk to test lights, maintaining dummy aircraft and waiting for bombs to fall on positions they knew to be fake, but German intelligence believed real. The cost-benefit mathematics was staggering. A K-site decoy airfield might cost £5,000 to establish. The dummy aircraft, painted installations and operational facilities for the ground crew. A single German bombing raid expended ordnance worth many times that amount. If a decoy drew even one raid away from an operational station, it paid for itself many times over. Colonel Turner's conservative estimates, compiled by historian Colin Dobinson in his 2000 study Fields of Deception, suggested that starfish urban fire decoys alone attracted approximately 968 tons of German bombardment. The airfield decoys almost certainly diverted substantially more, though precise figures remain elusive because German raid reports often didn't distinguish between successful attacks on real targets and wasted attacks on fakes. By 1942-43, most K-sites were decommissioned as the Luftwaffe's daylight bombing campaign against Britain ended, and German reconnaissance flights became less frequent. But the techniques developed survived. They informed camouflage doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The principle of painted shadows appears in decoy programs from D-Day preparations to Cold War dispersal planning. The understanding that what reconnaissance sees matters more than what exists remains fundamental to military deception. Turner's insight that film set designers were better equipped to fool cameras than military engineers proved prophetic in an age where satellite reconnaissance and thermal imaging dominate intelligence gathering. The painted hedgelines across RAF Yadon's runway, the canvas hurricanes on spindly poles at Gamba Farm, the fighters hidden beneath oak trees at Beaulieu, these weren't desperate improvisations by a nation fighting for survival. They were calculated applications of a principle that sounds obvious only in retrospect. Intelligence depends on observation depends on recognition, and recognition depends on expectation. Change the expectation, and you change what the enemy sees. Make them certain they've found your airfields, and they'll bomb shadows whilst your real squadrons wait in forest they never thought to search. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance cameras were excellent. Their photo interpreters were skilled, but they were searching for geometric certainties in a landscape Turner's team had systematically made uncertain. And in war, uncertainty is often more valuable than armour. That principle, worked out with paint and canvas and 15-pound dummy aircraft in the summer of 1940, proved more effective than thousands of tons of concrete could ever have been. The bombers came, the bombs fell, and the shadows burned. The real aircraft, hidden beneath trees that reconnaissance cameras dismissed as meaningless woodland, survived to fight another day. That was the secret. Not invisibility, but selective visibility. Show them exactly what they expect to see, put it precisely where they expect to find it, and they'll never look for what's actually there.